Welcome once again, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Wrecking Ball, our podcast series from the Historical Society of the New York Courts, where we explore those incredible intertwined themes of historic preservation, the law, and the great city and state of New York. And we have a guest today who is seated right at the crossroads of all three of those issues. Andrew Berman has been a fixture on the historic preservation scene in not just Greenwich Village, but across greater New York for many, many years. Andrew heads up the artist formerly known as Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, but now known as Village Preservation, which is one of the most venerable and beloved preservation groups by many in the city of New York. They've counted prior members as Jane Jacobs, you may have heard of her, but other modern contemporary folks as well, all looking to not just preserve the character of Greenwich Village for future generations to benefit from and be inspired from, but to also plant preservation seeds throughout the city. And we are really thrilled to have Andrew here today to discuss not just the big picture stuff that we've tackled in other episodes, but really the boots on the ground, what it means to be a preservation advocate in New York City. So Andrew, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I'd like to start off, Andrew, we're dying to hear you. How was it that you came to stumble into this preservation field? And how is it that with all these decades under your belt, you're still finding new and interesting issues to tackle? Who are you and what brings you here and what is your work?
Sure. Well, I've been the executive director of Village Preservation for about 22 years now. Prior to that, I worked for an elected official who represented Greenwich Village and other parts of Lower Manhattan and the West Side, first in the City Council and then in the State Senate. His name was Duane. So I worked for him for almost 9 years. So in that capacity, prior to my being at Village Preservation, I knew the organization, then known as the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. And obviously that work that I did previously had a lot of intersections with this kind of work: land use, preservation, planning, community organizing, things of that. My background prior to that was I studied art history, particularly architecture of cities, especially American, European. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I have some interesting sort of family roots throughout the five boroughs that kind of really informed my shaping me into who I am and my kind of appreciation for the city, its history, and its evolution. So in a lot of ways, I feel as though all of those brought me to village preservation and where I am today.
Absolutely. And it's so funny because after those 22 years and so many other years of public service before that, your name is almost shorthand now for a preservation advocate. When you meet with elected officials, as I did in my prior life over at Historic Districts Council, the line was always the Andrew Bermans of the world. So you really have become the Cher, shall we say, of preservation, becoming one of those people who's instantly recognizable, not just for what you stand for in preservation, but also how you stand for it. And I think one interesting thing about your advocacy is that it's so multifaceted. Could you just tell us a little bit about how village preservation works? Because you're not just testifying at the Landmarks Commission, right?
Sure. Yeah, we focus on a lot of different things. Our bread and butter to a certain degree is landmark designation, both ensuring that historically significant sites and areas of our neighborhoods, which are Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo, get the landmark designations that they deserve, and then making sure that once they're designated, they're regulated appropriately. Getting the landmark designation is really just the end of the first chapter. It's far from the end of the story. But, we work on issues having to do with zoning, small business retention, making sure that things like our parks and other public spaces are well designed and welcoming and there for the maximal utilization by the communities that they serve and the public. We work a lot with a lot of the small cultural institutions and educational institutions in our neighborhood that really help define these areas and that we want to hold on to and support and preserve. And so, we do that through everything from our advocacy work, testifying, proposing, pushing back, things of that nature. But we're also an educational organization. So actually, by far, the majority of the work that we do is around research and documentation about the history of our neighborhoods, and then sharing that with the public through programming, through online resources. I mean, I can't even count how many online maps, tours, things like that we have, but we're producing new ones almost every day. We've got this incredible video archive, oral histories with dozens of significant figures connected to our neighborhoods. You know, everybody from Jane Jacobs, who you mentioned before, who was a advisor to village preservation for many years. Jonas Mekas, the great filmmaker, is one of our oral history subjects. There's dozens of them. You can check them out all on our website, villagepreservation.org. So yeah, I think it's fair to say it's a fairly multifaceted organization that's doing a lot of different things at once.
Right, and including litigating, which is really at the forefront of what we're interested in terms of things that are strictly legal, but the policymaking aspect too. I mean, it all matters, and it seems like you're looking to, once again, inspire that next generation and get people engaged in thinking about the place they live in so that later on they're willing to take up arms if there's some sort of a proposal that you think may not be the best fit for the village. But I know as well that it's not all about no and stop. I think that village preservation has a vision for what you would like to see in the community, and that's often overlooked because it's always battle specific, right? It's always dealing with the crisis at hand. But would you mind just sharing a bit about what village preservation wants the city and particularly the village to look like?
Sure. Well, we want to hold on to the best of what's there, is even as change continues to be undertaken. And holding on to the best of what's there doesn't mean that. So if there's something that you think is historically significant or that you love, that it then is preserved in amber and never changes. I mean, in fact, our neighborhoods are really the birthplace in many ways of what's now referred to as adaptive reuse, which is taking buildings that were built for one purpose and changing them and turning them into something else. I mean, one of my favorite examples, of which there's kind of so many, it's like picking your favorite child, but Westbeth, which was built as over the years, as among other things, the laboratories for Bell Telephone, where these amazing innovations in sound technology took place over many decades from the late 19th through the early 20th century. Bell left in the late 20th century, went to New Jersey, and there was this sort of hulking agglomeration of buildings sitting on the Greenwich Village waterfront. And some brilliant people got the idea that maybe we could convert this into affordable live-work space for artists, along with cultural space, educational space. And that's what it is now and has been for the last 50 plus years. And that's just, one of many examples. I mean, our neighborhoods are full of, houses that were converted into theaters, schools that were converted into artist studios, loft spaces that have been converted into architects' offices. I mean, everything. So, our vision for our neighborhoods is one of ongoing and continuous dynamic change that builds upon the best of what's there before, and that, of course, does allow for new construction as well as the kind of adaptive reuse development that I've talked about before as well, but does so in a kind of a scale and a character and a design that really relates to the historical flavor of these neighborhoods. And we want a diversity of peoples. We want a diversity of businesses, particularly small independent businesses. We want good, small, local, cultural, and educational institutions. All of those ingredients are what make a neighborhood really vital.
Right, and that's why the village is such a magnet to this day. I mean, it's right there at West 4th Street. You feel that energy, and you have people coming not just from the five boroughs, not just from the tri-state, but all over the world to experience what's there and take back some of those lessons. And oftentimes, in some of the dialogue we hear out there in the public, there's often this phrase that goes around, "Not in my backyard." Obviously not entirely apt in New York, where backyards are very much at a premium. But folks are saying, look, I'm just trying to preserve my community and stay out, and all this is doing is raising, property values for me and forget about the rest of you. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? I mean, what are those people who are often heard more loudly, I would say, in the discourse getting wrong about what you're all about?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, our enemies or opponents try to paint us as, sort of people who don't ever want to see change happen. I think one of the most wildly inaccurate things that our opponents say about us is that we're anti-housing, which I
Mm,
find bizarre, given that, among other things, we've actually pushed for making it easier to convert buildings to housing.
mm,
And we've actually, in many cases, interestingly, pushed for changes to the zoning in our neighborhood that would encourage housing uses over commercial uses. And these people who criticize us and call us anti-housing opposed those efforts. Um, so, I don't want to, focus too much on the inaccurate things that people do say about us, but I will say this, a big part of what we're about is ensuring that there is a positive cycle of dynamic change in the neighborhood as opposed to a negative one. In fact, we often kind of point out what we refer to as the virtuous cycle
mm.
of change that has taken place in these neighborhoods over the years. And that's what we try to perpetuate. And hopefully that's a cycle that holds on to and celebrates the special historic architecture of the neighborhood, that highlights the stories of the many incredible innovations in civil rights history, artistic history, political history, musical history that have taken place in these neighborhoods, ones that again allow for a diversity of people hopefully to live here. And that's clearly one of the challenges that we have. In some ways we've been a bit of a victim of our own success, which is that we've helped create what is such a unique and unusual neighborhood in this incredibly rich architecture, this dynamic mixture of uses, that people really, really, really want to live here. And that, without a doubt, has contributed to it becoming a much less affordable, much less accessible place in terms of living. It remains an incredibly accessible place in terms of, utilizing the many institutions that are there. And I'll say this. I'll point to one other thing that our, enemies or opponents sometimes try to say about ourselves, that we're doing this only out of selfish interest because it's, sort of property owners or, what have you, who just want this for themselves. Well, in fact, all of the things that we're talking about are actually public goods that the entire public gets to sort of benefit from and partake in. I myself do not live in Greenwich Village and never have. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. The village has always been a part of what I've loved about New York, along with many, many other places. But I would be crushed, even though I don't live there and never have, if those incredible qualities of Greenwich Village and the East Village and NoHo were destroyed. It's part of what I appreciate and get to partake in as a New Yorker, as does every other New Yorker and visitor to the city. So really what we're about is preserving and perpetuating what is ultimately a public good.
Exactly. And all you have to do is walk around Washington Square Park and you instantly understand what the village means for the city. It is not the playground of merely the rich. It is the playground of everyone, where the rich, for example, can go to get a taste of what regular life is for ordinary New Yorkers and ordinary Americans. And I want to take things a little bit more specific now because we've spoken a lot about your vision. We've spoken a little bit about the tools in your toolkit. I want to talk about some case studies, and one of them is behind me right now. For those of you who are viewing the video edition of this podcast, as a reminder, we're a podcast audio. We're also video on YouTube if you want to check it out. And this is a white building. It has some saw teeth. It's over on 7th Avenue and it has a neighbor across the street. And together, this is a longtime medical complex. Long time, but not so much anymore at as grand a scale. This complex served folks dating all the way back to the incident of the Titanic, September 11th. A lot of people came through this complex, and it was an instance where you had this push for housing, but during that push for housing, there was also a potential loss of other community amenities in the form of healthcare. So, Andrew, what am I speaking of? And can you just give me the contours of this real life case study of how the village has been evolving over the last number of years?
Sure. Well, the building that there's an image of behind you is now part of well, it became part of St. Vincent's Hospital, and it's now the Northwell Health building on 7th Avenue between 12th and 13th Street, built in the early 1960s to the designs of Albert Ledner. A little bit inspired by the Guggenheim Museum, a bit of a sort of poppy knockoff of it in a certain sense. It was actually originally built, and you can sort of see this more in the design. It was built as the home to the city's maritime union. So it was where sailors and people who worked on ships, those who worked in that industry would sort of gather to advocate for their well-being, benefits, and things of that nature. But St. Vincent's Hospital several years ago closed tragically, largely due to a combination of the changing medical landscape in New York, as well as some very, very serious management problems with the hospital. And a developer was seeking to basically turn 90% of the land that St. Vincent's Hospital occupied into luxury condos. We could do actually 12 podcasts about the story of what happened to St. Vincent's Hospital and still not cover it completely. But long story short, what happened is the building behind you is the only remnant of St. Vincent's Hospital that's still serving a medical purpose. All of the rest of it was either converted into residential uses, very, very expensive residential uses, or torn down and replaced with new residential development. As part of that process, there were a lot of very, very painful lessons in that process. I think there was a lot of ugly things about the way real estate works in New York that came to light out of that, including the fact that, the hospital was originally given a zoning bonus to build a much larger than would normally be allowed building in Greenwich Village because it served this public purpose. And the developer who, once the hospital went out of business, wanted to tear down the hospital buildings and build new luxury condos, basically wanted to hold on to that zoning bonus now for their highly profitable luxury condos. And we pushed back on that. We said, look, that made total sense for building a hospital that was serving the public. That does not make total sense for building, the tallest, biggest possible luxury condo building. And we got them. We pushed it back somewhat, not as far as we would have liked to have. But that building is an important piece of the history and evolution of Greenwich Village.
Yeah, it's true. And of course, the great Christabel Goff, she always, and I think we've said it before on this podcast, she always refers to them as investors because it does reveal a truer motivation. And it's not just about developing for the sake of developing, it's about turning a profit, and we don't fault anybody for that. But what we do want to make sure, at least channeling the preservationists who may be listening, one of whom is here as a guest, saying, look, if we're going to invest, we want to invest in the community while we're also investing for the market as well. So the St. Vincent's case is very resonant. And, I think at its core, it spoke to the need for, yes, you can have housing, but what good is housing when you can't get to the hospital when you have a medical emergency, right? That is speaking to the broader scope of what a modern city is about. It's not just where you live, it's where you can live. And that's what I think your group has been very successful about channeling into the mainstream.
The irony also is that here was this huge swath of land in the middle of the West Village. And, we're constantly hearing from some of the people who criticize what we do. Well, nothing other than luxury housing is getting built in your neighborhood. So we need to, knock things down so that we can, build a fraction of it as affordable housing and most of it as, oversized luxury condos. And oftentimes it's actually the city that's making that case and using that as a sort of to kind of bludgeon us into submission for their plans. So here's was a multi parcel site right in the heart of the West Village, and it was the city It was the city that said, yes, we wholeheartedly approve this plan to turn this all into luxury condos and to build more big, huge luxury condos here. When what they could have done is said, some of this is, if it's not going to be a hospital, some of this has got to be affordable housing, mixed income housing, some other kind of service or facility that serves the public. So the city and a lot of these folks who, kind of push for these policies typically are the ones who have supported creating exactly the problems that they're then now trying to pin on us and others and saying, what are you doing to solve it? Which I just find endlessly ironic.
A little bit of cognitive dissonance, and I'm curious what you do in your free time to step back from all of that, because you really are in the depths of that trial by death landscape of real estate in New York. Are you looking at old buildings on your days off, or do you even have days off? What does your life look like when you're not in the trenches?
Well, I make sure I have a few days off here and there. Actually, it's funny, over the holidays, I went on vacation, and one of the kinds of vacations that I often go on with my partner and I, we often go like way out into nature. So we're
Yes.
far away from, the sort of the cities, all of those kinds of strife. So spent a week or so hiking in the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona. So I make sure I get, some different kinds of exposure, at least at some points.
Absolutely. Yes. People sometimes ask me why I went to law school in Colorado, and that is the very same reason. Sometimes we need to take a step away from the work so that the work itself can be even better.
Mhm.
And speaking of good work, there are instances that are sort of unlike the St. Vincent story, where history sort of gets in the way, and you have to figure out what to do with the structure after something has happened that you really had no control over. In the law, we would probably call it a force majeure event. I'm thinking of January 6th, for example, in the United States Capitol, where a decision was made to keep elements of that attack visible to people when they visited that structure. But I have a building in mind in the Village as a second case study. I believe it's on 11th Street, but I could be slightly wrong about that, where I believe there was a bombing of some sort back in the day, and the architects had to figure out what to do. Can you tell us about that sort of different preservation puzzle that village preservation is always involved with new construction and old renovations as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's just such a wonderful case study. It is on 11th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. It's often referred to as the Weathermen House, although it's,
Oh,
just a sort of a private row house. But for those who don't know, on this street within what was then the recently designated Greenwich Village Historic District in 1970, in the basement of one of this row of identical, lovely, circa 1840 Greek Revival row houses, there was a bomb making factory by a terrorist organization called the Weathermen. And one day the factory exploded, basically. I believe it killed one person, several other people were injured, and it destroyed the house. Basically, in terms of this kind of how do you mark that history question, there eventually was an application to rebuild on that site. And some people, I think quite understandably, said, well, the building should just be rebuilt exactly as it was. We should sort of fill in that gap in terms of this row of Greek Revival houses, sort of recreate the historic conditions. It's a landmark district. Why would we reward the bomb makers for destroying it? What was actually proposed was something that was some people would say you should start completely afresh. You can't bring back the past. It should be a completely modern, contemporary design. And what was ultimately approved there, and it was very controversial and very narrowly approved, was something that was kind of a little bit of each. And oftentimes, the sort of the compromise in the middle isn't necessarily always the best way of going. But in this case, I actually think it really was. The building that was allowed to be built there had many elements of the original Greek Revival house. In fact, if you looked at it from the first floor down or from the top two floors up, it looks almost exactly like the original building. But then in the middle, they inserted this kind of jutting, diagonally positioned, very dramatic bay window.
mhm.
which in a lot of ways was kind of symbolic of the disruption of history that took place here. It's disruptive of what is otherwise a sort of even, identical rhythmic row of houses. It's got this kind of thing in the middle that suddenly kind of says, like, as if the record skipped or something like that. And and at the same time, it gives the house a very big, dramatic bay window, which, is not a bad thing to sort of have. So in a way, it's a nod to, it's a way of acknowledging that something happened here, that there was some disruption of history, but that the history did exist and in some ways continues on around it. And I think, now 50 years later, it's looked at as kind of a classic response
Hmm.
to what was a sort of a very kind of challenging question of what do you do here? And we certainly think it's a very, very thoughtful one. And I think it's become, I think the ideas behind it have become a model in a lot of ways for how you do new design in instances like that.
Yeah, and it's a model for how, in my view, from a little bit of a distance, how preservationists look at the city. You've used that phrase "preserved in amber" a few times, and that's not what I think the practice of preservation seems to be. At least in modern New York, it seems to be what is the best future for this neighborhood, and how do the historic elements help create what Tony Wood said in our first episode, that stage set for urban life to occur, for the spontaneous connections inspired by the past. You don't meet new and interesting people in a parking lot, right? You meet them on a beautiful, livable city street, and that's why that example is so interesting, because it's dispelling a rumor, and it's also just a really interesting place to go by and make sure you have a meal at Jean's at the end of that block whenever you're through with your little visit. And I'd like to turn now to a different set of case studies, and this is a little bit more open-ended. I think back to the late Dave Frischberg's great song, My Attorney Bernie, where he's talking about his dealings with his attorney. And he says, when Bernie says I sue, I sue. And when Bernie says I sign, I sign. And I was hoping you might be able to bring a case study to the table where an issue has presented itself and you had to decide whether to engage with the legal process. And if you decided to go in that route, what litigating was like as a small but mighty preservation nonprofit. Do you have any examples that come to mind? And could you tell us a little bit about those experiences?
Sure, yeah. So we actually probably lean on litigation much less than a lot of our peer organizations, but we don't never do it. And clearly sometimes it's the only recourse left open to you. The most recent case where we were involved, this was actually a case where we weren't litigating, but we were pushing back against some litigation that had been filed.
Hmm.
So just to kind of set this up a little bit, the zoning in neighborhoods like NoHo and Soho had for many years prohibited private university expansion or development in those neighborhoods. It basically didn't allow most of what universities do to be located in those neighborhoods as a result of the zone. In 2021, the city rezoned Soho and NoHo very controversially. Whole
Hmm.
other topic we could, get in depth into. But one of the things that we fought for through that process was to maintain the prohibition on allowing particularly an entity like NYU to expand there, because if they could expand there, they would take over those neighborhoods. Obviously, the zoning can't and shouldn't say something specifically about NYU, but just, sort of generally about universities and those sorts of uses. So initially, the city, when they were working on the rezoning for the neighborhood, they included an allowance to let NYU expand in the neighborhood, which we fought back against vociferously. And one of the very few good things that the city council did when the rezoning plan came to them was they put into it a prohibition that basically would have maintained the restriction on private university development in the neighborhood that had existed for 50 years. So it would have continued that. Once that was approved and put into place, NYU then went to court to sue, to basically to say that this was kind of illegal discrimination against them. It wasn't particularly about NYU. It was for all university facilities. And we, along with some other community groups, engaged them in court. We filed briefs. And we filed to join the case because we wanted to argue against NYU's proposition that this was somehow discriminatory and illegal for them to be prohibited from growing there and adding new facilities. And the judge fortunately agreed with what was basically our contention and argument, and they threw the NYU case out. Which was great. So that prohibition stands. It's one of the few good things that came out of that rezoning, which was basically just that one good piece of the old zoning was not destroyed, in spite of the best attempts by both NYU and the City Planning Commission. But so that's one example of a case where we do get involved with litigation because it needed to happen, and there was really at that point no other way of fighting the fight.
Right. And, just for our listeners' benefit, I mean, I don't think you're against education. I'm an alum of New York University twice over, and you're a learned person as well. It's not about this institution or that institution or any of that. It's more about, again, the neighborhood character. Why, in particular, would this sort of an issue pose a problem to the neighborhood as a whole, setting aside the specific user?
Right. Yeah. I mean, NYU is a valued part of our neighborhoods. What I always love to say is we love NYU being a part of our neighborhood. We just don't want them to take over our neighborhood.
Right.
And they are the proverbial 800-pound gorilla in our neighborhood. And if you chart their growth over the years, they've taken over more and more and more and more of the neighborhood. So what we've tried to do is to, implore them, push back on them and the city to make sure that the university doesn't just continue to expand endlessly throughout our streets and blocks, and that they look at other channels for their growth. If they are going to be growing, which they say they're going to be, that doesn't involve just consuming more of our neighborhoods. It's not that we think educational institutions are bad. If anything, educational institutions are great. But, it's like when you're making a stew, any ingredient in that stew could be wonderful. But once it becomes the only ingredient or the overwhelming ingredient, then it's not so good. It's about the mixture of ingredients, and left to its own devices, NYU would become pretty much the only ingredient, as it unfortunately is in certain parts of the neighborhood. There's parts of our neighborhood you can walk around in now where you feel like in every direction, 360 degrees, it's nothing but NYU. And as somebody who grew up in New York, I can tell you that, when I was younger, that's not how those areas felt at all. And so that's a very dramatic change, and we don't want more of that.
Right, and many people within New York University, including administrators, including faculty, some of the staff, they'll acknowledge that the city is part of the educational process. It's the prospect they're offering to their students. And so you sometimes hear a critique from, not just to pick on NYU, right? And we're not picking on anybody today, but we had Dr. Christina Greer here in our first episode saying this particular issue, this issue of institutions of higher learning, not just in New York, but in, Pennsylvania, all across the country, getting such a big presence in this neighborhood that it ceases to be a neighborhood, it just becomes a campus, is an issue not just for the communities, but for the institutions themselves, because at some point you're wearing away at what you're offering your students in terms of an educational benefit. And I'm just grateful to you for taking a little bit of time on this now, because I think people are used to picking up the New York Post and seeing Andrew Berman, NYU, and they never really get the nuance behind what you're sharing. So I truly appreciate that, Andrew. Is there anything else you want to add on that topic before we move on?
Just that, as you said, I think ultimately it's in the university's best interest as well as our neighborhoods. People don't come to NYU because they expect to see, sort of like a classic college quad and some, sort of idyllic environment. They go there because they expect to be in the middle of New York City, and they want to be surrounded by and interact with things and people and institutions other than just NYU. So it really is just the leadership of the university. It's not all of the many wonderful students, teachers, faculty, administrators who tend to actually often agree with us. If the upper levels of the administration were just a little more farsighted, I think we'd have much more agreement than disagreement.
Interesting, interesting food for thought there. So we've covered three case studies. We've covered your vision. We're cramming a lot in here today, and I think before we take our break and move on to everybody's favorite segment, we might just take a moment and think about the future. Think about not just the future of village preservation, but the future of the preservation movement in the next couple of years, the future of the city, as we are about 2 decades, 2.5 decades now, really into this new century. It's still wild to believe that. What are you fixated on? What are you preoccupied with looking forward, Andrew?
Mhm. Well, I think one of the areas where there's seemingly an ever-increasing tension is between this idea that historic preservation and the need to create a diverse and affordable city are somehow at loggerheads.
Hmm.
I profoundly disagree with that. And as somebody who grew up in actually New York City, and I believe the country's largest affordable housing project, I come from a working class family in the Bronx. I care about both sets of issues very deeply. There's this really harmful myth that's being perpetuated by those whose, I think, real interest is just having there be as much unfettered development in New York City as possible, that anybody or anything that restricts development is the cause of our city being so unaffordable. And we've been doing some studies, which we'll be hopefully releasing later this year, that in fact shows that it's exactly the opposite, that in fact by encouraging as large scale of development as possible, that you are accelerating the process of making affordable housing in New York City disappear. First of all, there's so many wonderful examples of older historic buildings that have been converted to use as affordable housing that are just reservoirs of a diverse array of people and people of different income levels who live in them. So there's really no reason to posit that these two public benefits are at loggerheads. We can preserve what is most historic, most connected to our cultural history in terms of the built environment, as well as ensuring that we have a diverse and affordable city. And without a doubt, there's a lot of challenges to achieving that. And nobody's going to be able to snap their fingers and say, well, if we just do X, we're suddenly going to have a city that guarantees that everybody of every income level can live anywhere that they want. That's going to require a lot of work. But what's not going to get us there is simply saying, let's get rid of all of the things that prevent people from just demolishing buildings and building whatever they want in their place. That is a really, really pernicious piece of misinformation, which unfortunately has been just kind of proliferating, not just throughout New York, but throughout the country in terms of the debate about these issues. And, I think in terms of your question about the future of preservation, we're really going to have to right that ship if we're going to be able to continue to make progress in this regard.
Well, fascinating food for thought as always, Andrew. And as we turn towards our break, as we're looking to take a pause here and return for our favorite segment, your Daily Ada Louise, I do just want to remind listeners that Andrew and I sat down at the Jefferson Market Courthouse over the summer of 2023 and had a much more wide-ranging conversation than this quick one about all of this and more. So if you're interested in that, please do head for the Wrecking Ball podcast page on the Historical Society of the New York Courts website for a full video of that August 2023 presentation. So we will leave our formal conversation there, and we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with your Daily Ada Louise. Stay tuned.
Wrecking Ball is brought to you by the Historical Society of the New York Courts, which is dedicated to preserving just that, New York's vast legal history. For more information about that important group, just Google Historical Society of the New York Courts or visit history.nycourts.gov.
And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back here with Andrew Berman, talking about boots on the ground in the preservation world, with one of the most ardent advocates who's really been on the scene for many decades, shaping the debate, not just in Greenwich Village, but across the city. And Andrew Berman is here for our final little chunk of this episode, our segment that we call Your Daily Ada Louise, where we share a quote from one of those great thinkers in the world of the urban environment, the late Ada Louise Huxtable, who of course was the famed architectural critic for the New York Times and elsewhere. Andrew, what quote do you have for us here today, and how does it relate to the things we've been discussing?
Well, it's funny. I didn't know what we were going to talk about, but in many ways, these quotes are just perfect for what we've been discussing. And if you'll indulge me, I actually have two quotes. They're fairly brief, that I'd like to share. So the first one is, what counts more than style is whether architecture improves our experience of the built world, whether it makes us wonder why we never noticed places in quite this way before, which is just such a wonderful way of expressing what the sort of transformative power of design can be. And then Ada Louise also said, any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. And we will probably be judged not by the monuments we built, but by those we have destroyed. And sadly, that's as true today as it was when she wrote this, 50-ish years ago, which is that, while it's incredibly important, of course, that we keep building these, sort of wonderful monuments to who we are and our ingenuity and our design capabilities, in some ways, we're also going to be remembered by what we destroyed and are not smart enough to keep around for future generations to appreciate. So those are words we should never forget.
Very good. I'm so very glad that you shared that with us here today on Wrecking Ball, and we are going to leave it there with Andrew Berman. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us and demystifying a bit of what you're all about when you're out there in the public sphere, sharing a little bit about what you do, why you do it, and your vision for the future. So Andrew, thank you for spending your afternoon with us.
Adrian, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.